Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final Crossroads of Ideas for the spring semester. My name is Julia Nepper, and I'm a postdoc with a PhD in biophysics in Professor Joe Handelsman's lab at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. Crossroads of Ideas is a monthly series produced in collaboration between the Wisconsin Institute, the Morgan Institute for Research, and the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. The series is aimed at promoting dialogue between UW-Madison researchers and the community and tackles issues that matter to all of us. Each session features an opportunity for audience Q&A. We'll be inviting your questions via the chat, and you can enter them at any time. We'll be concluding the session precisely at the end of the hour. We also welcome your feedback. Here's a link to a survey to get feedback about the Crossroads events during these online times. And now, if we could have the land acknowledgement, please. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today, and join us in uncovering such truths every day. And even though it's not about climate change, I'd also like to acknowledge the historical result of today's trial against Derek Chauvin, as I'm sure it's probably on a lot of our minds. It's a momentous occasion for people and for people of color especially. The Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, WID, is an interdisciplinary institution that aims to tackle some of the world's greatest scientific challenges, from precision medicine to data science. We recognize that our views and systems are inherently biased, and we're taking an active role in making the WID welcoming for all people. To facilitate that work, we established the A-JEDI Working Group to promote the A-JEDI principles of anti-racism, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Some of our A-JEDI work is internal, involving developing strategies and building structures that support an inclusive research environment and promote diversity in science. And some of our work is external, with events like this one tonight. I'm here as a member of the WID A-JEDI group co-hosting this event with my colleagues from WID, Derek Smith and Sarah Miller, and WARF, Laura Heisler and Shauna Barnsick. The purpose of this session is to expand our thinking of the communities that are affected by climate change and to learn about how diverse groups are dealing with the reality of a warming Earth. Our team of esteemed panelists and moderator will address these questions around going forward with equity on climate change. What do we gain when we include diverse communities in the conversation about climate change? And what do we lose when we don't? The panelists and moderator represent scientists, engineers, experts, and leaders from diverse backgrounds who work with BIPOC communities to bring their perspectives to the state, regional, national, and global conversations around climate change. And we're also thrilled to have the Cap Times as our media partner for Crossroads this evening. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Dawn Krim, who will be our moderator for tonight's session.
Thank you, Julia. I am pleased to moderate this evening's panel discussion about climate equity. It is well established that the people who contribute the least to climate change are the ones who suffer the most from it. Tonight, we will hear our panelists discuss why that is and what can we do about it. I want to thank our distinguished group of scientific and policy experts for sharing their time and advancing this important conversation. I'm Dawn Krim, Secretary of the Department of Safety and Professional Services. Our agency is tasked with, among other things, updating and enforcing building codes for the state of Wisconsin. Building codes set the bar for sustainable building practices, both through what we require and what we allow. We are currently in the process of updating our building code. That work should both raise energy efficiency standards and also allow the broader use of emerging sustainable building materials and systems. Some estimates say buildings generate nearly 40% of annual greenhouse gases. That is more than transportation and more than industry. Clearly, changes in our building codes can make a direct and positive impact on all communities throughout Wisconsin. I also have the pleasure of chairing the Governor's Council on Equity and Inclusion. That council is charged with providing strategic guidance for developing a sustainable framework to promote and advance diversity, equity, and inclusive practices across Wisconsin state government. I've learned from doing that work and currently working at DSPS, and really throughout my career, that the more perspectives we bring to a problem, the fewer blind spots we have. This lends itself to a better understanding of the needs and ultimately solutions that work for more people. And I would say the same is true for climate equity. If we're working toward a healthier planet for all of us, we simply need to engage more of us. It is with that lens that I approach this topic this evening. And tonight we have a wonderful panel. Each panelist will introduce themselves. First up is Dorothy Lesotho. Dorothy was having just a bit of technical difficulties early on, and so here it's great to see Dorothy.
Hi, good evening. This is Dorothy. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm a Nelson graduate student currently in my PhD program, working with research and parts. My research is based in Uganda on air quality and health. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Next up, Lieutenant Governor Barnes.
Hey, Secretary Krim. Just want to say thank you so much for your leadership. I want to thank you also for your friendship and the service you provide to the entire state of Wisconsin, and the particular attention that you are paying to climate change and your role, and especially how it revolves around equity. So again, I'm Mandela Barnes, Lieutenant Governor. It's been a passion of mine. I've told people since our inauguration day that we are going to lead with equity and sustainability in mind. Growing up in communities that have dealt with impacts of pollution and the other factors that exacerbate climate change, I know personally how it impacts already marginalized communities. And having served as the chair of the Governor's Task Force on Climate Change, I'm proud to be involved in this work. I'm proud to be immersed in this work. And I'm proud of the direction that we're leading this state. We came into this state, or we came into office, we were lacking. And this is the moment that we have. And we won't have many more moments to get this right. So we set our goals and we are moving forward on those goals. It's going to take a whole lot of partnership, a whole lot of dedication from people just like you. So just want to say thanks for having me today.
Wonderful. Glad you're here. Next, we'll go over to Yi Yang Song.
Thank you very much. And it's an incredible honor today to to join such an incredible, amazing panel here tonight. My name is Yi Yang Song. I'm Associate Director for Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Institute at UW-Madison here. I grew up in a small town just upstream from the world's largest hydropower dam, China's Three Gorges Dam. Just because of that experience, I developed the interest in water resources and renewable energy and entered into this field as a result. For the past 19 years, I've been involved in nearly 100 renewable energy projects in 17 different countries around the world and a number of climate change programs globally. I have had great pleasure working with very amazing, talented scientists, engineers, and researchers that are from the communities of color. They are making tremendous contribution in the advancement of science to help us tackle climate change. And I'm really proud to call myself a teammate with these people who are wonderful and developing those resources and tools to help us advance our technology and innovations. So I'm really looking forward to share my perspectives and their stories with you tonight. Thank you.
Great. And we'll all mute ourselves when we're not speaking just to reduce a bit of the feedback that might come over the technology tool. And then we will have Ya Ampafor introduce herself.
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you all for being here. First, I want to note that as we are ramping towards Earth Day on the 22nd this week, which some of you know actually started or got its spark here in Madison, I think it's very noteworthy to consider, how the conversations about equity and justice have changed since the 1970s when we started talking globally about this conversation. And so I'm very thrilled to be here. I'm very thrilled to be part of this panel. My name is Ya Oparibia Ampafor. I am a third-year PhD student at the School of Education here at UW-Madison, and I'm also a planetary health scholar at the Nelson Institute. So coming from a School of Education, my work sits at sort of the intersections of the various climate change discourses, and then recently how education has been deployed, in addition to some of the technical and political approaches to thinking about how we might fight the climate change crisis that we're dealing with. So my research particularly looks at how we can think about the spaces and the people and the knowledge systems that are often absent and abjected when we invoke the term education, and how we might reorient the approaches that we take in an educational space towards addressing climate change. For instance, my dissertation is going to be examining how young people in Ghana are developing their own perceptions, are constructing their own meanings about human-earth relations, about well-being, about the climate crisis as they move towards various socio-ecological spaces, labor spaces, religious spaces, the extended family, and how those spaces can be considered as learning spaces when we think about education. So I look forward to sharing more about that with the rest of you and hearing your questions as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And then our panelist is rounded out by Andrew Curley. So Andrew, please introduce yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? Hey, yat she Andrew Curley nishe bilagana nishle hanagani bashachin bilagan dashache ki ane dashanale. Apologize for being late. There's often a confusion on my end with the time zones, being in Navajo Nation and then also in Arizona. But it's good to be here. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment. I study natural resources in Indian country, and I also look at energy transition and the impacts of these industries within our indigenous communities, both in the Southwest and in a larger sense. So that's who I am, and that's the kind of research and background that I have. I worked at the Dene College, the Dene Policy Institute in the Navajo Nation, and have worked on the issue of coal and coal mining there, and have a perspective about the looming energy challenges that we face as indigenous peoples and as a larger community. But I've also been talking with other indigenous peoples and environmental groups about issues of water and the future of the environment for our land. So those are the kinds of things that I will plan on talking about once those questions come up.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, everyone, for introducing yourselves. What I'd like to do next is have everyone just speak just a little bit about your perspective on the panel. It's been very exciting just hearing your introductions and the wide range of histories and backgrounds that we have. So given each of your unique vantage points, please share your interests and priorities regarding climate change and equity. And we'll start with you first, Dorothy.
Thank you very much. I'm excited again to be here to share the conversation we're having today, equity in climate change. I'll just to me. I long hours in my grandmother's smoky kitchen back home in Uganda, and knowing that only 6% of the population in Uganda use to cook, the energy burden for women who have to go and collect the firewood and then spend hours cooking. I then developed a passion to lessen the energy to women, and I joined Makerere University in Uganda, and I made environment management. Then later went into a research center that was working on renewable energy technologies. And while I was working there, I noticed that I was always the only woman in the projects. But also, what was interesting was most of the projects were heavily sponsored by the international community and were always led by people who are non-Ugandans. On a Nile Benson energy training that I used to go to, I had been to twice, and it collected Nile Benson countries from around the region. I was picked to give a token of thanks at one of the end of the trainings, and later that evening, as I walk into the store to do my last minute shopping before I leave for home, I see a group of young women following me from behind, and these women, one of them walks up to me and she tells me, "You're the woman we saw in a room full of women, in a room full of men on national television speaking, and they were all seated in suits listening. Can we take a picture with you?" I mean, I was like, yeah, sure. So they took a picture, and I can't believe that I thought of that store with discounts and sort of like a celebrity at point. I then wondered, for all the years I had been to the trainings, I was the only woman in the room, and not just the only woman, but the youngest, to make that very clear. So I asked myself the question, if I was a token trainee, and I also asked myself the question of, is that the reason why all the time I had been working in this project, working with the women, I was seeing very little success with the kind of work I was doing? So frustrated seeing that nothing was going to change if I did not do something about it, because I did want to work around these issues, but I also wanted to see success. So I decided then to apply to graduate school here at the Nelson Institute. And I'm currently working on the air quality issues, like I said, and my hope from this training, I'm hoping to get skills that I can then go back home and design projects with these women so that I can see the success that I wanted to see, that I failed to see all the years I was working for 7 years in these communities. And for me, what I started thinking about then was, if we want to really see change, or we want to see conversations around climate change have more diversity, especially women who are directly affected by the voice of these women. And I say that through training, mentorship, and support, that women up spaces in these conversations. I hope that with seeing people like me who are like working on these things like this, I feel like then we'll have more women to aspire to do like conversations like this. But at the end of the day, we'll then see more successful projects that are taking shape in these areas, and more specifically when areas mean Uganda, that is directly
Dorothy, that is wonderful. You're breaking up just a bit. So Dorothy, thank you so much.
I would want to say that it's been doing a very good job in many people to get into spaces.
Thank you. And so I really appreciate you sharing that, being among the youngest and one of the women in the room, an incredible perspective. So Lieutenant Governor Barnes, you talked just a little bit, you touched on it in your introduction. Can you talk about your priorities and your perspective?
Yeah, so like I said, my priorities are equity and sustainability. My priorities all center around the future, knowing that the next generation is going to have it hard if we don't do something, if we don't do the right thing, and recognizing that all the factors we're dealing with that center around inequity and inequality, I think that environmental justice is one of them, where if we tackle it, we can tackle so many other issues in the process. We could tackle income inequality. We could tackle health disparities. We can tackle disparate outcomes in education. But we have to be really dedicated and committed to doing that sort of work. When I look at climate change and how the impact is felt on the communities, like you mentioned, the ones who have done the least to contribute to it, the most wealthy corporations, the richest people in our society have totally disregarded the planet, and it's been at the peril of already marginalized communities. And so what I want to make sure we do is establish equity by making sure that we create safe, livable, habitable neighborhoods for communities, regardless of income, regardless of zip code, because that just hasn't been the reality for people. And we know that every child deserves a decent quality of life, but every child doesn't get that decent quality of life. And so if we don't start to address this issue, there's only so long that we have before it all just burns down. And nobody wants that. And we deserve not just clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. We also deserve healthy food, which is also an issue that is compromised by climate change. And then, I traveled the state a whole lot. Our first year in office, we got to all 72 counties. And a reason I remind people is, so if you heard this before, I'm just going to say it again. We got to all 72 counties largely in part due to storm damage tours. So we have, low income white communities, rural communities that are dealing with the impacts of climate change. And I get asked all the time about the work that we do to make Wisconsin a leader in addressing climate change. And people say, well, what is this going to do to rural communities? What's this going to do to farming communities? Is it going to cost them? I'll tell you what's costing rural communities. And that's these extreme weather events that are ravaging their communities, these tornadoes, these historic floods, this what seems to be never-ending rainy seasons in some cases, historic flooding that delays crops, and ultimately places a very difficult choice in front of people, whether it even makes sense to rebuild. Do they relocate? What do they do after one of these storm systems has come through and basically destroyed everything they have? And when I talk about lower income Black and brown communities, although the issues aren't necessarily exactly climate change, the same factors that contribute to climate change contribute to poor health outcomes for lower income urban communities as well. So this is all about quality of life, making sure that people in every part of the state, every part of this country has a fair shot. I'm very honored to have had the chance in December of 2019 to go on the world stage at the UN Climate Conference at COP25 to discuss the ways that the United States should be a leader here. And I mean, this is our responsibility to do something. And that's why I'm engaged in this work.
Great. Thank you very much. And so we've moved from Uganda to now around the states and surveying storm damage. So next we'll go to Yi Yang. Tell us your perspective and your priorities.
Well, thank you. So obviously my background is in water, renewable energy, and those are my strongest interest. And just from childhood, when I witnessed and actually experienced those flood damages from the Yangtze River and energy crisis, where people don't have power, people are forced to move to higher ground every summer for several months without electricity, without access to clean water, without access to electricity. That really engraved into my mind and engraved into my interest as a career, as a water resources professional. So these days, my priority is really try to raise the awareness of climate change and the inequity into that, the energy poverty that a lot of the community of colors are experiencing, and the importance of us having access to clean energy and equal access for all the communities to access that kind of resources for us. And also just provide the resources and opportunities for the community of colors to get adequate education, training, be treated fairly when they're applying for jobs, giving them mentorship opportunities, and help them grow and be leaders in our community and being leaders in the sustainability world. So what I really want to do as a priority for my career right now is to support those leaders, those brilliant young engineers, scientists, researchers to achieve their goal in the climate change world and build a better future for ourselves.
Great. Thank you. A lot of youth engagement, and not just youth, but the younger generation and people that are looking at climate here and now. So, yeah, can you please share your priorities and your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Dawn, and thank you to the rest of you for you've already. This is a great foundation for those of us who come later on. So, in an education space, for those of us who are concerned with sort of the educational angle, if to map out, the really straightforward two-way relationship between climate change and education, you have, on one hand, we're seeing how climate change is impacting, for instance, schooling, right? People's access to schooling, disease, various disasters, various people's livelihoods are being upended by climate change, and it is affecting our various educational systems. And on the other hand, like I mentioned in my introduction, we're seeing how education we're increasingly talking about what is our educational response to climate change, right? So really simply, that's the relationship, right? Climate change is affecting our educational systems, but on the other hand, education is being seen as a response. And I think of education very broadly, right? We often talk about schools, but my priorities are very much focused on what are the spaces that we miss when we talk about our educational response to climate change, right? Whose knowledge systems, knowledge about whom isn't involved in that conversation. So if we take this relationship from an equity perspective, we can say that the impacts of schooling, the impacts on schooling, the impacts on education are going to be higher in marginalized areas, in low income areas, in areas where the equity conversation about education more broadly is already a challenge, right? We're already dealing with the inequities that exist in our education system. So what happens when you tack on a climate change angle? And then if you look at the other side of the relationship, what is our educational response not doing as an equity space? What is our educational response missing? Should our response needs to have a conversation about the power imbalances. It needs to have a conversation about the disparities. As the Lieutenant Governor mentions, our educational response should point out the role of corporations. It should point out the role of states, the role of large businesses in our response to that. When you look at our educational response right now, a lot of it focuses on, you hear about we, so it's very focused on the individual and how we as individuals need to respond, but it doesn't necessarily talk about the inequities that underpin that and underpin people's abilities to respond. And so very broadly speaking, that's the relationship that I want us to look at when we talk about how an equity lens can be brought into our educational approach. Thank you.
Wonderful. I appreciate you really kind of rounding it up and really thinking about the impacts. And as we speak about education, Andrew, I'm going to move to you to talk about your priorities and where you are. I know you are on at an institution, but you also do represent other things. So I'm interested in hearing your priorities.
Thank you. I think that there's a number of things that Indigenous nations throughout the United States have to think about when we're talking about equality, equity in the response to climate change. And we're thinking about issues of exposure to some of the worst environmental impacts of climate change, desertification, drought. A lot of our nations, a lot of our people are land-based people who rely on livestock, who rely on fishing, or who rely on hunting and other kinds of on the land types of economies in order to survive or for certain kinds of sustenance. But at the same time, we're also nations that have developed industries in and around our lands. And these industries are also impacted by things like energy transition as a larger U.S. energy infrastructure shifts. And as we talk about this issue of infrastructure on a national scale, how is this going to impact Indigenous nations? Indigenous nations in Wisconsin and Arizona, all throughout the country. And so we got to think about the colonial context in which Indigenous nations live and the kinds of federal Indian policies and laws that continue to shape the relationship between sovereign nations, state governments, and the federal government. And so when we're talking about environmental equity and equality, the issue of sovereignty is first and foremost for Indigenous nations.
Thank you for sharing that. As you think about Indigenous nations and the impact on Indigenous people, Julia read the landmark statement on the ground, the Deja grounds that we are standing on, and actually having this segment on. And then Lieutenant Governor Barnes talked about going around the state and hearing from various voices and those impacts. And as I think about the federal, the sovereign lands, and the people, Lieutenant Governor Barnes, can you talk a little bit about maybe any perspectives that you learned over this past year as you've been leading the task force, as you've gone around the state from our Indigenous people? Yep, you're muted.
I'm actually on a Menominee reservation at this moment as I speak, and I'm going to tour the Menominee Forest tomorrow, and it was important for us to have Indigenous voices as a part of this conversation, as has always been. And given just the generations of knowledge that's just been there, and the things that people may think of as groundbreaking, for whatever reason, this is conventional wisdom. And so we could obviously take a whole lot from that knowledge, from that base of knowledge. And I can also give this perspective too, because the same thing is taking place in Africa, and with the tie to the land with communities. I was just reading a story in the New Yorker about conservation efforts in Kenya and how it tends to get whitewashed, and it's happened in the same exact way. I wish I would have pulled up this quote. If I was ready for it, I would have had it. I would have had it prepared to read, and maybe I'll pull it up while somebody else is speaking, because I think it's very salient to this conversation. People of color have had a very close connection to this land, Indigenous communities, of course. And when I talk about like the wealthy interests who oftentimes have just run amok on, with all of our natural spaces, with very little regard for what came as a result. These are the same people who are doing just fine in life right now. And climate change isn't going to necessarily impact them, because if they need to relocate, they'll have the money to do so. And it just leaves already, I should say, at least communities who've already been challenged in an even more difficult and precarious situation. And so, I am proud to continue to partner with the 11 federally recognized tribes here in the state of Wisconsin to do the work that we need to do. And I've had a chance to visit 9 out of the 11. The pandemic kind of slowed that down, but we do intend to get to each and every one of them, to have true, open, and honest conversations about how we can best be stewards of this land together.
Great. Thank you. When I think about who is not at the table, you touched on education quite a bit. When you think about this moment in time, as you said, it's changed since the 1970s. So when we think about the educational approach, what maybe needs to change for these times when we talk about education and climate change and just environmental justice?
Right. Thank you for that, Dawn. So this is a difficult question to answer exclusively as a climate change question, because there's a larger conversation about the social justice and equity issues within our various education systems, writ large, right? And climate change is only a small part of that, a significant part, but a small part of that. So one of the things that I think we need to address, first of all, is how we think about achieving equity within education, right? How our education systems themselves can become more equitable in terms of various resilience practices, various access programs for people to be able to access various forms of education, whether it's schooling, whether it's broad public engagement, whether it's media mediated knowledge. So that's like sort of the larger umbrella space in which our education systems probably need to be thinking about how they can become more equitable. And it's probably why you'll hear some people say, for example, that schools are not the space where our climate change conversation needs to be happening, because it's a space that needs to change before we can take a climate change conversation into that space. So you'll hear some people say that. And then the second thing is how within education, so how our education approaches can themselves address the equity issues in our conversation about climate change, right? So we know that knowledge hierarchies exist. We know that we've constructed our education systems to privilege certain forms of knowledge, to privilege certain spaces where knowledge can happen. And so, really simply, an educational approach to an equity approach to climate change needs to think about these hierarchies and needs to think about how we dismantle these hierarchies, right? We need to acknowledge that there are a variety of ways of knowing, there are a variety of ways of having a conversation about climate change. And then we also need to amplify the work that's already being done in learning spaces that we aren't considering learning spaces, right? So there are spaces where education is happening that we're not recognizing as such. And we need to think very critically about how we begin to acknowledge the work that they're doing and amplify the work that they're doing. So yeah, really simply, that is just, without going to too much detail, that's how I would start that answer.
Well, no, I appreciate you talking about leveraging and really acknowledging. So that makes me think about some of the things that Yi Yang talked about when she talked about her childhood and raising the awareness as you think about access around clean water and electricity. So from what you've just heard, Yi Yang, from Lieutenant Governor Barnes and Andrew and Ya, what things come to mind for you?
Well, thank you, Dawn, and thank you everyone for setting up the stage for this. Certainly, when we look at climate change, most of us think about the extreme weathers that cause flooding, drought, more hurricane, power outage, as we just experienced in Texas, right? Which we would have never imagined in the past. So these are real, and these are causing a lot of influence to our society. And climate change is a global issue. And it doesn't only happen in our region, doesn't only happen in the US, it happens everywhere in the world. But what we can see is there are large populations of communities of color, whether it's within US or outside of the US. People are living in areas with less access to fresh water. They are more vulnerable to flood damage, extreme heat, drought, hurricane, and power outages. And they live in areas with less energy infrastructure. One of the recent studies that was done basically said during the power outage in Texas in February, the areas with more communities of color have 47% chance of experiencing power outage as compared to 11% of the communities of white. Of course, there are multiple causes in relation to these numbers, but it's very alarming to our society that there is a very big social disparity of the communities, of the majority and communities of color, what they are experiencing, what they're facing, and what resources are available to them. So we need to face that, and we need to address them on a global scale. Another example I can think of is that in other regions, South Asia, sub-Sahara areas, and people living around the equator, they are actually the ones that are most vulnerable to climate change, flooding, drought, that severely impact agricultural production, dairy production, which they rely on heavily. I worked in Africa where I see people, don't have access to water, and yet now they have even less access to water because of climate change. We all heard about the Cape Town, water shortage. Same thing. So we just need to be aware these things are real, and we need to work harder to address those kind of disparity issues.
Yi Yang, I appreciate you moving outside of the U.S. and really taking that global approach. And so that makes me wonder, Dorothy, as I think about the work that you're doing, as I think about Uganda, can you speak to some of the responses that they are having to climate change there?
Yeah, sure. I like that Lieutenant Governor did mention about the similarities with Africa and the indigenous communities. I worked on a project here actually with the Indian communities, and I was very surprised to see that the same issues that I was working on while in Uganda, were the very same issues that I found here in Wisconsin. And so for me, it was like eye-opening to see that it's very connected. And I'm still like wondering how we can do this, but when I look at the approach, it would be, I was thinking about things like how we're all connected, and even with the pandemic showing us that we are all connected. And so we cannot just be looking at climate change or issues like these in just the concept of, oh, it's a thing that only affects this area and won't affect this area, but like just drawing from the lessons we've learned from the pandemic, hoping we've learned anything from there, and use the same approach for answering the questions around solving the issues of climate change. And so, yeah, I don't know if I've answered the question. I am having issues with my network, so I lost part of the question. So I just had the last part of the question.
Nope, that's okay. You hit it just fine. And so, another thing that has come up from the panel as we talk about these extraordinary weather events, when you think about, Lieutenant Governor, when you think about both heat waves and floods, how they've disproportionately affected really the formerly redlined communities, what would you say are the steps that could be taken to address this challenge?
So you mentioned redline communities. Also could talk about communities that had interstate highways intentionally built right through the middle of them, which is another thing that's happened in Africa as well. But the fact is, we have to build more resilient communities now because we find ourselves playing defense against the weather. We find ourselves working to have to mitigate the devastating impacts of climate change. So some of the things that we need to be sure to do, and I guess this is definitely where your work comes into play, is because the buildings that we build, not only do they need to be more efficient, they also need to be built to be able to withstand these historic weather events, because there's no sign of them letting up right now. Even if we went to 0% carbon emissions overnight, we would still be dealing with the impacts of poor decision making from the last generation, from the last few decades. And so with that in mind, choosing to build infrastructure that isn't just for cars, choosing to build infrastructure that allows for more safe and walkable communities, that allows for more mass transportation, that allows for more bike lanes, whatever the case may be. We have to think with community in mind, and we have to consider like how these neighborhoods, like you said, these red line communities, these are folks who want access to clean renewable energy as well. But obviously cost is a factor here. And one of the things we have in our climate change task force report is like on-bill financing, so that people who want to have solar or solar projects on their own home can be able to do so at an affordable rate. Because right now, lower income communities are even priced out of being they are priced out of sustainability. Forgive me. Even our food systems, we have to build. And I know you talked about redline communities and how do we, build around them. But I think we should think about like the societal needs that we have to build, because our food systems are all out of whack. We need to make sure that we have local food programs available for people to have healthy, nutritious food. And, if it's almost impossible, honestly, for low income people to go to a co-op and go buy organic food, right? But when we see these neighborhood gardens popping up in different places, and when we have access to farmers markets, and making sure that people are able to use, able to use their food share benefits at farmers markets, then we are able to not just build like the building infrastructure, but also like the human infrastructure, making sure that people, their health and safety is accounted for. I think those are just that's just a start of the things we have to do. But if I do have 1 second, because I did find a quote in this story in the New Yorker, and it was, and I'll cut it really short. And it's just, coarsely speaking, The current white paradigm is that African wildlife is in danger, and the problem is that African people don't love the animals like white people do. That's in quotes. And then it goes on to say, I would like to see a model where Black people are treated as the true custodians of the wildlife, with which they share their land and are intellectual participants in the discourse around this wildlife. That would be the Black paradigm, one in which white people are most welcome to participate. And then it goes on to say the question betrays the problem. And why do you think we weren't involved in conservation before? And how do you think wildlife survived before white saviors came? And that is like a direct correlation between people on the continent and indigenous people here in the United States of America.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that quote. I mean, and really what that quote says is there are many perspectives that need to be at the table that can then represent their perspective, not someone representing or misappropriating perspective that may not be in fact accurate. And so when I think about buildings, and I'm glad you moved over to food, and it's about people, but as you noted, for the Department of Safety and Professional Services, we are updating those building codes because we are wanting to take advantage of energy efficiencies and ensuring that it's equitably available to people. And so if you make it a part of the building code, it becomes part of the standard. So then the standard in which we build and create more progress within the infrastructure is then something that's available to everyone because it is the standard for everyone. And I think that's what's so important when we talk about environmental justice around climate change. It's availability to all, and it's building the sustainable infrastructure that supports all. And so, Andrew, I saw you shaking your head quite a bit as Lieutenant Governor Barrs was speaking about some of those perspectives. Please add to this part of the conversation.
Yeah, there's so much that the Lieutenant Governor said that resonates in Indian country, and that resonates, I think, for many of us who are brown or Black or non-white in so many ways. And so I think that this issue of food that the Lieutenant Governor has brought up a lot, that's something that's really important, especially for rural communities. A lot of indigenous nations are rural communities, and we are impacted by food deserts. The Navajo Nation, of which I'm a member, is about the size of West Virginia in terms of its land base, but we have 6 grocery stores in the whole reservation. And many of these grocery stores are stocked with commodity-like foods, very bad, starchy foods, fattening foods, things like that, which creates all sorts of health problems and that contribute to the high rates of COVID transmission. We have these and COVID and complications from COVID because we have these pre-existing we have these pre-existing conditions that come from these food deserts. And so, these are inequality problems that have to do with access to basic resources, access to basic necessities of life are fundamentally environmental issues. They're fundamentally issues about how we live and we breathe and we work on the planet. And so those are the things that I think a lot of indigenous peoples are working with are aligned with other groups, Black communities, Latino communities, and thinking about these issues about these structural inequalities that exist in rural areas and urban areas, and especially the access to some of these basic necessities like food. And when we start to grow our own food, when we start to practice food sovereignty, that's when we start to take control, right? And that's when we start to develop a relationship with the land and the environment around us. And each place has a different kind of ecological niche. And we grow different things in these different climates and these different elevations and these different lands. And so that allows us to learn from the land and not to just put stuff on the land and take from it. So I think those are really important things that the Lieutenant Governor brought up.
Thank you for sharing that. What I appreciate about this panel tonight is all of the different perspectives that each of us bring to the conversation. So when I think about those who have joined us and who are watching, who have not had the luxury to hear the different perspectives and the voices that we are presenting here, Well, I'm going to go around the panel and ask you, what suggestions do you have for communities to be more inclusive to these perspectives and the voices that we're bringing here tonight so that they can contribute to the climate change discussion? And so, Dorothy, I'm going to first start with you. And it may take us a few minutes. I'm going to come back around to Dorothy because she still may be having a little bit of technical difficulty. So yeah, I'm going to go with you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I could go on the whole night speaking about this conversation, but
All right, Dorothy, I'm going to have you hold now, and I am going to go ahead and go to have you answer that question, please.
Sure. And Dawn, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're asking what the people who are listening to us themselves can do and think about. Is that your question?
And
Yeah.
providing them with suggestions to be more inclusive of the voices that they're hearing here tonight if they're not included in their conversations.
Right. So I think broadly speaking, and you've heard me talk a lot about like knowledge, right? And I think, first of all, I think we need to be mindful and reflect on our various biases when we think about what gets constituted as knowledge. And so in a lot of conversations that each of us is having in this space and other spaces, I think we need to sort of expand how we attribute, sort of various forms of validation, various forms of acceptance of types of knowledge and the dismissal or sort of the hierarchies that we ourselves put towards types of knowledge. An obvious one is sort of, where scientific knowledge sits against other forms of, traditional spiritual, iterations of the environment, how written knowledge has sort of taken preference towards a lot of oral traditions that get lost in the conversation. So I think in various spaces that we go into, in various spaces that we continue to have a climate change conversation, I think it is important for us to think about, whose voices are we, not just whose voices are we letting be there, but how are we, there's a ranking system going on in our education space, in our knowledge system space, and how can we sort of destabilize that when we allow people, even when we allow people into the room, right? So I would say that it's not just about having multiple voices in the room, but sort of what levels of validation do we ascribe to them when they're in the room, and how do we define that?
Thank you. Thank you for adding that and talking about it from a knowledge standpoint, because you're right. Sometimes there are some hierarchies around knowledge and who is knowledgeable. But when you look at the contribution, we have to value those voices that are coming to the table because they are bringing a perspective that's been impacted and they have something to contribute. So thank you. So Yiying, what suggestions might you have to make sure that those who are listening are listening not just here at the panel tonight, but others in their community that bring perspective to this conversation?
Well, thank you, Dawn. I feel extremely lucky to be on this panel, to be at this event, being able to leverage this public forum to voice our opinion, to encourage people to participation and awareness of these issues. But I think there are many other channels and forums where people can contribute and can add their input to this topic. For example, my organization, we try to encourage underrepresented community to apply for our positions, to engage themselves in research. I would highly encourage people to get involved in this kind of conversations and opportunities and be kind of at first hand involved in climate change research and advocacy. And other opportunities such as Department of Energy always have public hearing opportunities where they are soliciting public opinions. Everybody has equal and fair opportunity to send, their input, their comments to some of their initiatives. These kind of resources are out there. Maybe some of us, we can, make that more available to the general public so they know when and where it exists so they can participate better.
Great suggestion. Thank you very much, Yi Yang. Lieutenant Governor Barnes.
I just feel like, in this space, there is just a lot of room for us all. And even for the people who are doing the right thing, there's still space for us to grow. And one thing I want to mention is, a part of the task force, I was just circling back with members once the formal work was almost completed, and a person who I've known for a long time was he just said thank you for the environmental justice aspect of it. And this is a person who has dedicated much of his career to addressing climate change, and is a person who wants to do the right thing. Like I have nothing bad at all to say about the person. It's actually somebody I learned a lot from. And he's just like, I just want to thank you for your perspective and bringing that to the forefront, because I never considered these things. And all the work that I've been doing, this just never, it never came to mind. I just never thought about it. And so there's a lot of room for us all to grow. There's a lot of room for us to teach. And there are a whole bunch of folks who want to do the right thing and think they may be covering all the bases and aren't. But it's important that we keep talking about all the factors that aren't always considered. So I am appreciative anytime I get to be a part of these conversations myself, because I still learn things, and we have to look at this as a journey.
Great, thank you. And so, Andrew, please share, what suggestions do you have? You've been at this for a long time, and you are hearing a variety of perspectives. And so how do we keep this conversation going? How do we have people that are engaged in this panel also hear voices when they're not having the opportunity to be at a panel such as this?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think that what's really critical is not only representation and having a lot of different voices, but having mechanisms to empower many of those voices. And what I mean by that is that when we're looking at structures of law, especially like when I'm thinking about federal Indian law and environmental review, we're often, we're supposed to be treated on a government-to-government basis, but we're often excluded in final decisions of projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline, which the Standing Rock Sioux tribe opposed, and yet that pipeline was built. So in those kinds of instances, we need to have veto power. We need to have mechanisms to be able to stop projects that we find to be in violation of treaty land, to be in violation of our reservation lands. And so those are the kinds of things that are very easy to identify. It's a simple mechanism within existing federal Indian law to allow tribes to have a veto power over proposed projects that might be harmful to the community or reservation lands. Those are the kinds of things that I think are important when we're talking about empowering people and bringing more voices to the table.
Great, thank you. And I don't know if Dorothy, if she's able to join us back in quickly, but just, 30 seconds or so, Dorothy, you might talk about those perspectives as well. All right, I think we are still having some technical difficulties. And so I will just like to say it's been great having the opportunity to moderate this panel, to hear the variety of perspectives. And then I'm thankful to WID for beginning this conversation and allowing me to moderate and bring in the perspective from the Department of Safety and Professional Services, as well as that of the Governor's Equity and Inclusion Council. So I will now go ahead and hand it back over to Julia so that Julia might close the session.
All right, thank you, Dawn. And thank you everyone to coming to hear and listen about this very important topic. We would love to have you join us next year for the next Crossroads session, and have a great night.